Hi, welcome to the talk. Thank you all for your attendance. We want this to be as interactive as possible. I'll introduce our panel. We have Harsh Sule from Rutgers. We have Dr. Mike Gottlieb from Rush. We have Dr. Jim Miner from University of Minnesota, Anthony Rosania from Rutgers, Arlene Chung from the University of Vermont, and I'm Neha Rocker from Mayo. We have no relevant financial disclosures. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today is the academic value unit. It's kind of a newish concept. We're going to talk about why we should be developing an academic RVU system. We're going to outline the development of an academic RVU system, maybe how you compose these committees and how you get stakeholder engagement. We're going to talk about potential funding sources and maybe different RVU structures that other programs have employed. So our agenda, we'll intro it. We'll talk about the components, getting buy-in, overcoming barriers, and then as time goes on, how do you adapt this RVU system to changing times? So we know historically that academic productivity has often been benchmarked to research papers and H-index. But we also know in academic medicine that there's so much more to our story than what we just publish, right? There's committee involvement, there's educational activity, sort of these invisible things that we do. And how do we weigh that? How do we recognize that? How do we value the people that do this work? And how do we reimburse them, or what do we do for those people? So frameworks often assign standard credit to these sorts of assignments. And so we bring you this concept as a way to sort of say we need structure and accountability and distribution of work across the department. So we think about three different things. We think about how funding is under pressure, and as GME support is plateauing and clinical demands rise, we know that protected time is harder and harder to come by. Then we also think about the teaching load that's poorly distributed across faculty. Typically, it's a core group of faculty that give all of the lectures, and how do we distribute that, or how do we just balance out all of the work? And finally, we also have this risk of burnout and attrition because people are not feeling valued for the academic work that they're doing. And so how do we incentivize this sort of work? And so this concept of an academic RVU, actually in the literature, it's often called an educational value unit, right? But we know that's more than education as well. Dr. Gottlieb did a scoping review in 2023, and he found that there are over 50 programs, not just in emergency medicine, but across all specialties, that talk about this educational value unit. And the way they're structured varies very widely, but the common goal is to align your effort with your departmental mission and funding. So as we think about designing an effective RVU framework, we think about the different components. But what we want is a system that's transparent, right? That's the first thing. We want to be able to distribute these responsibilities more equitably, and we want to be able to support accountability, faculty engagement, and professional development. For example, there was an institution that put this in place, not as a way to be punitive, but just put this in place just to recognize what people are doing. And they realized that their department was giving 2,000 hours of unfunded work. And so it's a way to talk to your dean's office about what the academic productivity is. So it's not a metric, really. It's an attempt to create a system that will value that work that we're doing. And so people don't feel undervalued.
Hopefully this works as well. Can people? Yes, I think it does. So let me ask you to start off with one question. How many people use clinical RVUs of some sort as an incentive model and stuff like that? Quick show of hands. So about half, maybe a touch more than that as well, right? So the concept in some ways, if you think about that, is we assign people to work hours, and then we measure their output in some form by clinical RVUs, and then we incentivize in some form for their production. On the academic side of it, we assign people hours in terms of clinical hours again, and we're saying in that you have protected time that you can do something else with. But very often, we don't go that next step in measuring output, and then the next step even is rewarding or incentivizing that output as well. We stop at that first step. And that becomes the first argument, if you might, in favor of a dashboard in measuring these academic RVUs, because we do this in the clinical arena all the time in different ways. But we're not doing this on the academic side of it. And the challenge is less about, because one of the concerns people often raise is, well, I don't know why I need to log my time, produce it. I'm just producing stuff. You see my papers, you see my output, et cetera. In a weird way, it's actually not as much about those high performers. It's about the rest of the group that is not putting in that effort, but still has some amount of protected time, whether that's a minimal amount of 4 hours per week, a little bit more than that, whatever it might be. And so in this, what you're trying to do is actually incentivize them to produce more, or I don't want to use the word penalize necessarily, but at least put out in the open what's not being done as well. Because I think that's an important way of kind of aligning all of these things. So in terms of components and themes, Neha talked about the educational value unit, and that was the origin of this in some ways. People talked about origin. Am I teaching? Am I doing other things? But what we've realized soon is that there's a lot more we can do with this beyond just the educational slice of it as well. Research. You could argue that, well, research, the output is grants, funding, and if you bring in funding, that helps pay your hours, and there is something to be said for that. But I think there's a lot of other places that you can be doing this as well. So, oh, yeah. Go for it. Oops, no, not this one yet. Just keep that going, slideshow. So what we want to do is, and this is going to be a little bit of our interactive piece of it here, we're going to have you kind of break out, just turn around, find a group kind of thing. What we want to think about is activities and themes that we think should constitute an academic RVU. When you see this with the SMART goals up there, you're probably wondering, well, it is evaluation season, so that is the time of the year that we do these in academia as well. But there are a couple of these that I found to be very relevant, which is that if we're going to measure RVUs or calculate RVUs, whatever you want to call it, they do need to be specific. They need to be clear. They need to be concise, all of those things. They absolutely need to be measurable in some form. Actionable, yeah, because if I can't influence it, if I can't try to give another lecture or do another few interviews, it's not going to help me out. So it needs to be actionable. They need to be realistic in what we achieve as well. And the time frame, of course, because we're capturing this over a 1 year period or whatever else. So in a bizarre way, as I started thinking about this, I was like, the SMART stuff language applies to this as well. So with that as the framework, what we'd like to do is, and maybe we can do 4 or 5, actually it doesn't even matter how many. If you want to just circle around, turn around, and split up into groups, what we want us to do is spend about 5-7 minutes thinking about what are broad themes or ideas that should be part of an academic RVU dashboard. So things that you're thinking about are like what I mentioned, lectures, interviews, papers, abstracts, whatever those might be. And for each group, what I'd ask you to do is come up with your top 3 and give us 2 that you think are out of the box ones. All right, so we'll take 5 minutes on that.
I got the med student with the She got a mic. Yeah. Sorry, I thought it was that one. I'm sorry about that.
And
then I can write it out.
is where we can write out. Okay. So yeah.
Sorry about that. Oh, we're circling around.
And if anyone has questions, let us know for sure.
How you doing? You look fabulous as usual. How do you get the rank to stay?
I don't. I just get it done before every conference. So it's like.
I have talked to my hairstylist. I've known you, and I'm like, I know people want hair. And she's like, I have to bleach it and do it, and I'm like,
And then it fades out, but I always get it redone right before I come out to my conference.
it looks good. It's not even frizzy or dry or anything. You do a good job.
Yeah, I don't do anything else. No deep styling and nothing.
Oh, I do all of. I do the keratin, the heat. I do all. How are you doing?
Stage.
Like your Vermont job? Oh yeah. Oh, sorry. There's one in every group, right? Can your chair help? Or is it just putting it on? Part of it.
No, I don't know. I mean, it's gonna be part of the stage. It's like also.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Here.
Okay, everyone, we're going to pause there. So what we're going to do next is, if I can get everyone up's attention. Okay. So the good part of this is that, so in most presentations or whatever, you'd have tables or signs, or you'd call it out. This is where emergency physicians do really well, clearly, because you just give a broad goal of like get from here to somewhere out there, and everyone gets there. So it's great that this worked. So what we want to do is, continuing along that theme, we're not going to go each group to group. Just a little bit of a show of hands about in your group what showed up as one of the top themes, and if there's something that was an out there metric that you think most dashboards probably would not capture and should be in there as well. And we'll try not to have repeat ones, and we'll have a little discussion around those as well. So any volunteers for what should be getting captured? Either a big theme, small theme, whatever you want to do. Volunteers. Otherwise, I have to pass the mic around then. So are we passing the mic? Yep.
So relationship building, so mentorship time with junior faculty or junior learners, residents, etc.
Okay.
Community engagement. So if you outreach at a resident-run free clinic or something along those lines, that should fall in there. And then our last one was unsuccessful submissions. So grants that don't get accepted or papers that don't get accepted, but still recognizing the amount of time that went into that effort.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any comments on any of those three? Because I'm sure some of these themes were discussed in other groups as well. How do people feel about those? So mentorship, relationship building as well. You could even take that down to a granular level of number of students you've mentored, number of residents, et cetera. Go ahead, Mary.
Discuss that particular thing, but my thoughts on all of this is how do you not transactional?
Mm-hmm.
And when I look at this for our metrics for promotion, all of this is promoted, and at my institution, we're paying more.
There you go.
So not
Yep.
everybody. So there's a lot of intangible value that we got from mentoring relationships, from being in the community. And we actually have specific community engagement metrics for promotion movements.
Okay.
Wow.
Could everyone hear that? I can start passing the mic around as well. Okay, I'll start. Thanks first. Who else wants to comment on something they have in there or one of these? I know there were a lot more ideas.
Yeah, I couldn't Yeah, my group is shy. I'm Lynn Richardson from Mount Sinai. So, one of the things at the core of this is I think you have to decide how many hours are in a work week because at its base, this is accounting for hours. And when you think of it that way, it starts to make a lot more sense. We it's fluctuated over time, but we have somewhere between a 55-hour and a 60-hour a week work week that's expected, which I think is pretty common for academic faculty. And so if you're only working 30 or 32 or 34 or 36 clinical hours, that leaves a lot of time that needs to be accounted for. And I think a way to be able to demonstrate what you're spending your time on. And as you say, for the chair to see, well, who's not really doing anything with that time? They're showing up for their shifts and doing 2 resident lectures a year is really why this becomes valuable. But it's a combination of the quantity of things you're doing, especially for something like mentorship, the quality of what you're doing. And then the impact, either financially or otherwise, on the department of what you're doing. Though I do agree, being a researcher, all submissions should get some kind, you spend a lot of time putting together a grant, whether it gets funded or not, putting together a paper, whether it gets published or not, though the paper should all eventually get published, you just have to persevere. But grants, sometimes the answer is no. So it's quite complicated, but I think the more granular we can be, the more it will resonate with everyone. And then you didn't want to take the mic, but you talked about hospital work, things that you do on the operational side. Maybe it's just a task your chairman gave you without a title, accounting for all of those things that really help the department, liaison to radiology or to, internal medicine when there are conflicts with whatever it may be. So it's really trying to quantify all the things that go with any of the missions. So I love the idea, obviously, of measuring and quantifying these things as a researcher, but you have to be very comprehensive.
And we'll talk about this a little bit more in terms of the transactional piece, how you measure it as well, because some of these are measurable in hours, some of these are measurable in some other type of output, and what's that equivalency becomes part of it. This is there.
So we didn't, I don't know if this is on. There it goes. So we didn't really talk about this in the group, but one of the things that well, I've been thinking about doing this is evaluations, completing evaluations, and not only completing them, but completing them in a way that's useful and helpful to the resident. So not just clicking or student, not just clicking all the boxes, but actually thinking thoughtfully about comments and putting in useful comments.
Absolutely. I think that comes down to the quality of output. And now what you're getting into in the bizarre way is the fact that someone's got to oversee all of this and interpret that as well. And now they're going to put it back for their time. Others, someone else in the back, other comments? Anyone with the out there one that you think most people would have missed or an idea that should be on here?
QI of resident ultrasounds or anything else that they're doing.
So what we did was, so these are some of the common themes when you look across the literature in terms of what exists. And so in parallel, what I should say as full disclosure is from the Faculty Development Committee, we've had a subgroup that's been looking at this for the last year or so. And that group pulled a bunch of literature that exists, not just emergency medicine based, but from other specialties as well. And then Rob Cooney, who's one of our group members, put that into ChatGPT, did some magic, and came out with kind of broad themes that existed, more out of curiosity. It's not going to be our true methodology in that sense, but out of curiosity. And these were, when you go through it, edit through these are the kinds of broad themes that show up. And then you have to start thinking about what are the metrics that specifically align with it as well. And the challenge becomes, how do you measure it then? Is someone physically just giving you a CV at your end of year review, at their end of year review, and saying, parse through this, tell me how my ARVs did? Not very practical. Do you have the admin support staff to be able to do this? I'm at Rutgers, it's a state institution, we do not have that. dashboards of some sort. So we tried creating a dashboard. The buy-in into that is limited. You can put in all the buttons you want to, make it look nice, gets difficult as well. Or is there some kind of faculty information system that exists that's able to do this as well? So I think these are some of the challenges that we face there as well. And now, as we think about measuring them and all, I'm going to hand it off to.
Let me try not to have an accident back here. Okay. So nice to see so many friends from all parts of life here. So thank you for coming to this. If you've been listening to the past 21 minutes of this presentation and it's really getting you excited about the changes that you can see in your own department, the next step that you're probably thinking is, how am I going to get buy-in from my leadership? And so I just want to do a quick demographic poll of everyone who's in the audience. Who in here is a chair of a department? Or leader of a service line, or sort of similar type of position? Who is a vice chair, sort of a vice chair type position? Okay, wow, lots of vice chairs. Anyone else who's like a leader of an educational program or a research program, or otherwise looking for ways that faculty can get credit for the work that they're doing, particularly within your own sphere of influence? A little bit in the back. Okay, excellent. And so we have a wide range of perspectives in this room, and you may hold some positional power yourself, but it's very likely that no matter what your position is, you're going to think about stakeholders who are both above and below you in order to get buy-in for this system. And so this next part's really going to talk about looking upwards. What we're really talking about here is change management, and obviously a full discussion of change management is outside the scope of this talk, but this should look fairly familiar, especially as most of you are in leadership roles already. I like Cotter. I think it's a very common model that most people use, and really all we're talking about in this session is at the bottom here, this creating the climate for change. And so which you could argue is actually the most important part, is really being thoughtful about how you're going to implement this process. And specifically, when you start thinking about how to get buy-in from leadership and how to get buy-in from stakeholders, what you're really talking is, how do I build a coalition? How do I build a powerful coalition that can support me in this change and really help manage the rest of the department, some of whom may be supporters of this, some of whom may be resistors, and some of whom may be otherwise neutral in this space. And so it's really important to think about, because your leadership is going to be really important. Leaders can help you remove obstacles and barriers that could be in your way to implementation. They can, allow access to different resources that you may not otherwise have. And then there's a cascading influence where if the leadership in the department really buys into a new system, they have an outsized impact on the rest of your faculty going down the line. So getting your leadership buy-in is going to be really important no matter where you sit on that ladder. And some very specific strategies that you can go to your leadership, whether it's your vice chair or your dean or whoever it is that you're trying to approach to maybe gain resources or maybe get their assistance with implementation. There's some really concrete ways that you can approach this. And so in thinking about this, I think aligning with your institutional and departmental mission is really helpful. So most academic departments of emergency medicine, we all have the tripartite mission, right? Clinical excellence, education, research. And so oftentimes, and I'm sure you can think in your own shops, it's really hard to quantify and value the educational mission. And that may be more, to varying degrees supported with your own department. And so going to your leadership and saying, I have this really great idea that can help support the educational or the academic arm of our mission, can be a really powerful argument, again, for your leadership in your department. Another way to look at it is, you're looking at a way to incentivize faculty behavior. I guarantee you that your leader in your department or your leader in your institution is going to be very interested in how they can change faculty behavior. And as we all know, people will do things that are incentivized, right? We've seen this in a number of different contexts. You can think of obviously like clinical RVUs and ways that you can change people's behavior if you incentivize it. And there's obviously a flip side to that where people will stop doing behaviors, again, if they're not recognized or rewarded. And so some other very concrete, specific things to think about as you try to figure out what elements you're going to measure, what elements you're not going to measure, and how much you're going to reward each of those things. But certainly coming to leadership and saying, I have a way to motivate faculty to do X, to have greater involvement with the medical school, to put out more scholarship, to have more national engagement, right? These are going to be things that are going to be really important to your leadership. And so framing it in that way can be very helpful. And if you've ever read anything on conflict negotiation, it's really, you want to find win-wins, right? You want to find areas where you align. And so that can be one way to do it. And one very specific area that I'm sure most leaders in all institutions are really looking at is how can we retain our faculty? How can we engage them? How can we prevent burnout? How can we keep them engaged and loving the work that they're doing? And this is a really concrete way to really provide some faculty development and some clear guidelines, especially for junior faculty who may not have a ton of experience in terms of what the expectations may be going into an academic medical center, to say, hey, early in your career, like these 3 things, like focus on these things, and this is how they're going to be measured at the end of the year. And it's a really great way for your division heads, your vice chairs to provide concrete feedback, especially to your junior faculty who are still trying to figure out how to make those 60 hours work for them. This is going to be very brief. There's not a lot of it. But again, I know, and it's like, oh, it's like I don't have tremendous solutions. I'll put that out there. And I think that is, unfortunately, the reality of academic emergency medicine in the current climate. I think costs are going up and the budgets are getting tight. And any conversation of how do you incentivize and reward faculty behavior will eventually touch on, does that include any kind of monetary compensation? And it's not totally obvious to you already. Academic productivity, scholarship, it doesn't generate revenue in the same way that clinical activities do. And so funding those activities, incentivizing those activities using traditional models is very difficult. Raise your hand, do you have some kind of like geographic distribution, bonus, incentive compensation, some model of that out there? Okay, so actually less common than I would have expected. That's a very common way that people will sort of dole out different amounts of money to faculty members, again, to incentivize behavior. And certainly that's one model to do it. I would encourage you to think a little bit creatively. For those of you who are who are affiliated with medical schools, there may be some money that is available from the college for engaging in teaching activities. So if your faculty are going over to the medical school, there may actually be some funding streams that are available there, although I think regardless, it's probably not going to be a tremendous source of your revenue. But thinking creatively about it is going to be really important. The next thing that comes up is like, are there non-monetary ways to reward or incentivize faculty? And I would just we had talked about this yesterday in preparation for this session. We would just caution you against using things like clinical shifts or those types of, because it's a zero-sum game. Somebody has to work the clinical shift. Somebody has to, really engage with the clinical excellence arm of your department. And it ends up in this vicious cycle where if you reward folks for their academic productivity with time, you have other folks who don't have the time and then therefore cannot engage to the same degree in their academic productivity and then continue onward in that cycle. So again, being a little bit cautious and incentivizing that way and being thoughtful is going to be really important. For those of you, and thinking about this talk, I also, if thinking about, oh man, like how are we there's gonna be no appetite for like funding this kind of thing. Some departments out there, and I don't know if anyone in the audience has this. We have this at the University of Vermont, but there are institutions that will provide different levels of base salary depending on your academic rank, whether you're assistant professor, associate professor, full professor. That is indirectly, if you think about it, that is an indirect way of actually financially incentivizing your faculty to, produce academic value units. The only difference being that those metrics have been decided by your medical school or by your university, right? You have not set those promotion metrics. Those metrics, align with the promotion standards there. But if you pivot and think, maybe there's a way that we can develop a more concrete set that is applicable to our department and our faculty that also align with the promotions elements, there's a way to find synergy in that area. So again, thinking creatively can be really helpful, particularly in these challenging times.
All right, so building on that, I want to approach this now from an operationalizing standpoint, from an implementation science standpoint, from saying, this is all well and good, but how do I get people to actually do this? So I spent a lot of time reading through pretty much every single paper that's been out on this topic and talking to people across multiple different types of systems. And I found a couple of key themes, because we all want to, if we're going to do this, we got to figure out how do we do it so it actually works. Tons of literature in the medical and medicine showing how we don't follow guidelines very well. Things can be out there. We can have good evidence, but we won't do what we're supposed to. So how do we get people to follow this? If it aligns with what our leadership wants or what we believe our mission is, how do we get people to actually do it? And a couple of key themes arise from this one. And this was without ChatGPT. This was me. And so reading through it, first, and foremost is that there's no one size fits all. There's no cookie cutter model that works for each institution. As you heard each other's examples today, some fit really well. Some examples you're like, oh yeah, this resonates. I absolutely want this. And for some, you may say, well, my faculty are already doing this. I don't need to, heavily incentivize this. They're actually internally motivated to do so. For some people, your institutions may highly value research. For other ones, it may be not an institutional priority. And so where you build your value systems and where you kind of rank them, where you put the value behind them is going to differ. And we need to be okay with that. Looking across the street at another institution, yes, it's really good to see what they've done, but that doesn't mean it would actually work in yours. In fact, if their alignment is not aligned with yours, you can actually cause some real harm. If we say, all right, we're going to focus very heavily on throughput, and that's going to be our primary metric, and we're going to put everything else lower, you're probably going to lose some researchers, or at least some research effort. You're going to lose some educational effort. And vice versa, if you do that, you may find that all the focus on education may actually harm your clinical throughput, as there's so much focus on getting really good training for our residents and really good hands-on time and really good evaluations for that piece. Another metric will drop. So starting to figure out, where does that align with what you want? Where does it align with what leadership wants? And also talking to your faculty. So as any good, change involves, you want your stakeholders. And Dr. Chung did a great job talking through about like the stakeholders up top, everyone kind of along that chain. We also have to talk about everyone that's on the other side of things. Oh, actually, yeah. I'll open this up a little before I spoil that. So as you think about on your end of who would you want input as you're building this out? Who can help to influence, what you select, how you select it, how you rate it? So what's some ideas? You can go with nothing?
If you have a large enough group with vice chairs and division chiefs, they can actually identify metrics that you don't know exist. So really digging deep into that group.
All right, so we're looking at chairs and vice chairs. We're looking at some of the leadership. What else? Program directors. All right, and really educational leadership. Why? I agree. Why?
Because they have a stake in what they need for the education of their residents. Same thing with clerkship directors for the medical students.
Absolutely. All right. What else? How do you think the faculty would feel if now the program directors, the vice chairs, the chairs all said, this is what I want you to do? How do you think that would go? How about the clinicians who are working, 13, 14, 15, 16-hour shifts, or the ones who are the nocturnists being pure clinical? How do you think they'll respond when you say, hey, we're actually going all education and all focused on throughput, when your night shifts, you actually have complete stagnation? You think they'll land well or no? Not right. How do you think that from, for example, even thinking about from the resident lens, what do the residents value? I think when we think about, who can weigh into this, everyone's opinion is valued, and it goes across the entire chain all the way up from there to even, what do your staff think? It doesn't mean necessarily that it's only the people who are directly affected, either payers or receivers of this. It's who's affected by this model, because the model you make is the model that is going to then influence how people act. And so we have to be as broad as possible. We have to look through, see what other people are using, talk to every step along the way. Talking to, for example, I threw in here is also things like, finance. How are our projections for finance, seeking the funding, or also just where do we see that we get a good return on investment? Maybe we can make a solid argument for the clinical RVUs in a different way. What's valued across that way? Understanding what is valued across the system, how it aligns with yours. And the other piece is we have to be malleable. And we have to be willing to assess it. We have to be willing to put the microscope onto ourselves and say, hey, you know what? This actually worked really well. This one didn't. Because if we leave something in stagnation, we're not going to allow us to continue to push the new metrics we want, the new growth we want in people. We have to be able to reevaluate time and time again and see, all right, now this is dropping. How do we re-incentivize this and use this as a more malleable type model than just a stagnant thing that's a one and done? Skip over them.
Oh, okay. So next we want to talk about what does success look like. So I'm curious what all your thoughts are on how you know your academic RVU system is successful. How do you measure that? Anyone have any thoughts on that? I guess to some extent you have to think about why are you doing it, right? What is the goal in doing it, right? A bunch of you, I know this question was asked. I'm going to ask it in the opposite question. Raise your hand if you don't have an academic RVU system. And of the bunch of you that say you don't, how many are buying down people's time or giving people fewer shifts to do other work? So you have a system, you just don't know that system, right? You haven't modeled that system, right? And so I want you to think about it. Anyone thoughts on how we know what success looks like, though? Right here.
I would think faculty satisfaction of the system would be a big component of whether it's successful.
Okay. So faculty satisfaction, and that's one reason why you might want to do it, right? And I think people have seen that when they've implemented these, that transparency helps faculty feel like they're sort of honored or rewarded for what they do. You may already be rewarding them, but people don't know how those rewards are working or why people are getting them, and we'll get to that in a second.
So it was interesting. One of our business people said, when we create this system, how will we know that it's successful? And one of the successes was, are we giving the money away? You know, if it's a financial amount of pot of money, is it being given out? If we create a system and that nobody meets the criteria, and so we don't give any money, on one hand, that's great. And on the other hand, that's a total failure. So one of the suggestions was, are we tracking how much of the money that we set aside to give away that we're actually giving away? And that's a success sign.
Yeah, I think when I think about this, part of my sort of paradoxical answer, because I think I have a couple slides and they're all going to be about paradoxes, is, you know, this is the measure of success if you're doing it. If you're not doing it, though, you're not measuring your success, right? Like, you're not really getting a sense for everything that people are doing. And so when you go to roll this out at a place where it doesn't exist, that's going to be really important because people are going to resist it, right? And we already kind of talked a little bit about change management. We're going to hit on it again. But so a phased approach really helps to doing this. Everything I do, I'm an operations person. I know there's some more people I know in the room. Everything we do, we call it a pilot. I can't tell you how many pilots I've done that are still running today. And we never even said the pilot was ending, we're going to continue. People just forgot that we called it a pilot. You know, so I suggest a trial of this is really important because, once again, the way I look at this, you're going to be modeling what you are already doing. You are already giving people time. You're already buying down their hours. These things are already happening. You can't tweak the model to be successful until you have a model to begin with, right? And so we'll talk about tools that can do that in a little bit, but building the model, right? I sort of have this principle in operations that a variable, but sort of a less variable, less ideal process is preferential to a highly variable process, right? I'd rather get the variability out of the picture and know where I am and then move the sort of the thermometer a little bit than be kind of all over the place because I don't have a process. And there are tools that can help you do that. And communicating it is really important. People need to know what to expect. So you run a trial, you announce the trial is going to run, you get feedback from faculty, you get feedback from all the stakeholders that Mike talked about, and then you build a process and you put an end date on that trial so people know it's going to be over. People are going to feel safer because it's about that fear of change. And then when it's over, you gain feedback again and you tweak the process. So it's a rapid cycle improvement done in phases or a phased rollout, but it starts out as a pilot. And yet, change is hard, right? One of the best change management quotes I ever heard in my life is that people hate change, but people also hate the way things are. But it's so important because if you leverage that hatred for the way things are, then people like buy in a little bit more, right? The current system becomes the enemy, and then you take it over. And I told you it was about paradoxes because you might be worried about fairness, right? But we'll go back to the people who don't have a system, but are giving some sort of time and buy down. Is your system fair? Yeah, or you don't know, right? The answer can only be I don't know, right? If you don't have an academic RVU system. So hopefully, if I had one goal today, it was to inspire people who don't have a system to think about a system, because you do have a system, you just haven't modeled it, and you don't know if it's fair. And if you approach it that way, I think your faculty are not going to be as nervous about the system, because what they're worried about is the system you build is not going to be fair, right? But if you sort of model it to begin with and develop this idea that it could potentially be fairer than what we do now, I think you'll see some real buy-in on that. So administrative burden, this is hard. It's especially hard early on, especially if you don't have a software solution. We're going to talk about that a little bit at the end. I am an informaticist, but one of the things I tell people when they're looking for an application is you have to have a process first. If you're kind of have half an idea on your process and you buy into a software or a tech solution based on sort of a half-baked idea or a half-formed idea, you sometimes end up baking things into the system that like are broken. And then it gets even harder to change your process a little bit, because now you got to change your software, right? So I think early on, these things take a little bit more manual work, maybe a little manual database, maybe an Excel spreadsheet. I don't know. You all have probably done some of this. But until you get through that modeling period, you don't necessarily know what you need in your technology. And then people need transparent design, right? People should know what's going on. And your tech solution should reflect that. It should put out a dashboard that everybody can see where they are, right? They may not see everything, right? But they should see at least how they compare to their peers. Interestingly, and some of you may have leveraged this already, but a lot of the software solutions that your institutions use for faculty recruiting, HR work, as well as promotions and appointments, have the ability to do some of this academic RVU work, right? And I learned that from ChatGPT. I'll admit, I learned a little bit more about it. But they are built with integrations where they can pull things from PubMed, where they can scan in CVs and post things already. And that's one of the things you want to do to reduce your administrative burden, is develop a technological solution that takes away all that work. Because I think I heard in the back when we had the small groups before, a lot of people talking about all the work it takes to enter information into a system, and that'll kill your system. But if you're doing it as a pilot, you may have to do some of that. But then at some point, you want to move into a solution that makes this a little bit seamless and takes away the effort required. So with that, we have some recommended reading and conclusions, and I'll hand it off to James.
Thank you. Oh, I don't need the clicker. I think we've got zero slides. I'm Jim Miner. So just kind of bringing this all together, to mention a little bit like my experience with this. I've been the chair at Hennepin, and we developed a system like this about the time I started. And the reason we developed it is I came into a system where we had time I could allocate to people, and everyone had a base pay and a variable pay, a lot of people like that. And how we divide up that variable money had basically done just kind of at the chair's discretion, and everybody felt like it was really unfair. And I wanted to make it fair. And I wanted to be able to incentivize the work we needed, but in a way that was useful. So like the researchers have reduced time, but if I only give reduced time based on their grants, some of the most top cited papers from our institution were just unfunded clinical research. I didn't want to suppress it. So I needed a way to balance that, because we needed both. For educators, I needed the people who were great lecturers, but I also needed the people that would do a lot of the behind the scenes hard work that it takes to run a residency program. For administrators, I needed people who would go to the committees that nobody wanted to go to and do a lot of hard work in the background. We needed ways to incentivize everything. So we developed a point system. And the way we fund it essentially is we take that variable income and we assign points based on RVU productions and all these points we design, and just divide up that money by those points. To everybody, this is how many points you earned. This is your share of the variable. And it was complete and very transparent. Everyone knew exactly why they were getting paid, what they did, and why the other person was getting what they got paid, and what they could do to improve it. And it's worked very well. But the things that I didn't expect from that, really, I did it just to make transparency. But what I found is it did two big things for me. One is it gave us a framework to be democratic as a group, because we discuss what points are worth, and we vote on it, and we have debates, and it allows It allowed me to structure discussions around what is valuable to our group and what do we need to be doing with one another. And then second, it gave a really good structure for my reviews with faculty, because I could say, here's your points. And if you want to make more money, or if you want to move up, and here's some things, and this is how valuable they are to the group. And if they say, well, I do this and it should be valuable too, I said, great, let's bring it to the next faculty meeting and have the group vote on it and see if we're going to add that as something we award points to. And we do include things like community engagement. We include flexibility for the group, so that person that's always willing to cover the other person's shift, that's actually worth some points in our group. And it's valuable because you need that person, right? Who maybe they just show up for their shifts, but they show up for other people's shifts sometimes too. And you need a partner like that. And the other thing and final thing I would say is, when I have a new faculty, it gives us a really good place for getting them steered in directions that aren't, a new faculty loves to say yes to everything. And we get to have them now, they had like a menu of, well, if I say yes to this is worth 1 point to the group, and this is worth 10 points to the group. I'm gonna do the 10-point thing. And it gave us a way to kind of target. So for me, it's been incredibly useful, and it's been incredibly valuable to our group for group harmony. Because if there isn't any extra money from it, we don't have more money. We don't have, the time we assign is essentially, it's all fixed. But it gives us a structure to discuss it as a group in a way that makes people not feel left out and not feel like, how come I'm working all these shifts and that guy is 0.2 and I don't even see him around, they're not doing anything. Because everybody thinks that nobody's working as hard as them in academics, right? Everybody's working really hard, but a researcher doesn't understand what an administrator does, and an educator doesn't understand what the researcher or the administrator does. Really only the chairs and vice chairs see that, and they see everybody fighting over it like, oh no, you're all working hard. But this gave us that structure. But anyway, thank you all for coming. I think we've reached the end of our time. Questions? We have 2 minutes. Yeah.
So this is at the fundamental core of it is change management. We talked about project model. I'm interested from your perspective implementing this. What changed? Not just perception of fairness, but did it change how work was done, where people did effort? Did it change your perspective as a chair as far as people willing to do stuff, or did it just feel safe?
A lot of it was just feeling seen, but some of it was, it allowed me to incentivize work that I had trouble getting people to do. Because we can incentivize. When I got there, I didn't think we were involved enough nationally. So I was able to add SAEM committees as a way to earn point. And I was able to add being a reviewer or being on an editorial board. And so it just got people out there doing these things and being, oh, this actually is valuable. So it allowed me to incentivize behavior that I wanted as chair. And I stopped being chair 6 months ago at Hennepin. There's a new chair, and I'm sure he's already changed the system a little bit to incentivize what's important to him as chair. And I think that's key. And now I'm starting a kind of a new academic group, University of Minnesota, which is a half mile away. But I have a very different system there than I had at Hennepin, because it's a brand new group, and none of them are doing those things. So I could bring in Hennepin system and everybody gets 0 points. So it'd be useless. So I have a whole new one there where it's just like, let's be on a hospital committee. Let's, teach a medical student. It's a different group, different thing to do. But really it's a communication tool. I've always been a pain researcher, so I analyze it I compare it to a visual analog scale, which doesn't mean anything except that it allows someone to tell you what they think. And all this really does is allow me to say what I wanted and the people to say what they're doing back and forth, and then have us discuss it as a group. Yeah.
This is what you're going to judge on, and this is what the expectations are. And so, going forward, like, this is how I work with things. We don't set them on, it was an agreement on it, they have to things around it. We may use a different model to think about promotion, and we'll think about how well they've done it, but there's still a base on the must do to maintain it. I wonder, is that part of your job descriptions or expectations?
Yeah, so the ugly end of this is it's also been a tool for when I'm telling somebody they're losing reduced time or they're losing some salary. I can structure it saying, here's what the rest of the group's doing, here's what you're expected to do, and here's what we have. And so that's different than what we all expected. So now we're changing these things to fit what you're actually doing. And that was the downside of it. And it actually made me a very unpopular chair for a year or two with some of the senior faculty at some pretty sweet deals. But it also made the group more fair. Long term, it was pulling the Band-Aid off. It needed to be done. But it goes both ways. And it was useful in both ways. Probably to the rest of the group more useful in the negative side than the positive. But I like to think on the positive side.
Thank you all so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.